Welcome to episode 6 of Write Your Novel from Start to Finish. I'm Professor Ken. I've got Pork Chop again. We've done a lot of planning up to this point, and now we're going to talk about Act 1 of your book. And I'm using the phrase Act 1, even though it's mainly like a screenwriting term and a cinema term. I'm using Act 1 because I want you to think about a couple of very specific things to accomplish in the first 20 to 25 pages, okay? So let's talk first about beginnings, because beginnings can be kind of tough. There's a couple of ways to do it, right? If you're a horror fan, I strongly recommend picking up a copy of Stephen Graham Jones's The Only Good Indians. It's probably one of the best horror novels of the 21st century so far. And one of the things he does in his beginning is he kills off a main character in the beginning of his novel. That's how he starts his novel. And it's very effective. It definitely sets the tone for the rest of the novel. If you are a fan of science fiction, there's a really wonderful author named Arkady Martine. I think that's how you pronounce her name. And she wrote a book called A Desolation Called Peace. She wrote another book called A Memory Called Empire. And she starts out by sort of like basically getting us past a death. So a character has died and our main character is actually going to take over this other person's job. And so that's kind of where we start. We basically start at a place where something has already happened, and this character is sort of being thrust into a new position. And it works really well because the reader feels that way too. The reader doesn't fully know what's going on either. So it's easy for us to empathize with this character. It's a great way to start a story if you are planning on basically throwing your character into a new situation right out of the gate. With mysteries especially, one of the cardinal sins a writer can make is not putting a dead body in the beginning of their story. There are obviously authors who get away with not doing this, but in terms of like what an agent might expect, or in terms of what a publisher would expect of a first-time writer, or a writer who's had some experience being published but is looking for their, I don't know what you call it, your big break or something. A lot of times in a mystery novel, you're going to have to get a dead body in those first few pages. So one thing a lot of mystery authors do is a lot of mystery authors actually create a prologue that introduces the murder victim and ends with the victim getting murdered. That happens sometimes in horror stories too. Not as often in sci-fi. Oftentimes when we start sci-fi, we are basically jumping into a situation with a character who is either, a fish out of water, like Arkady Martine's book, or we start with a character who is starting a new job or visiting a new world or is, entering some new situation that is alien in some way, pardon the pun, right? Romance, you can start a lot of different ways. You can jump right into this character that you're going to be following, the protagonist. You can start with like a day in the life of, which is actually one of the ideas we're going to plan out today. And then with like fantasy, there's a lot of different ways you can go. I mean, if you've ever read, the original Game of Thrones by George R.R. Martin, you know that it starts out sort of like a mystery or like a horror story. And then we jump from character to character later on. If we look at this bookcase, so like Gold Fame Citrus, definitely just starts out with two of the main characters looting an abandoned building. So that's one way to do it. Let's see. Oh, here we go. American Gods by Neil Gaiman, right? And one of the things you'll notice if you ever read American Gods by Neil Gaiman is he is literally just going to basically get his main character out of prison, and then we're going to start the story. So there's a lot of different ways to do it. What I would recommend for you, because of the way publishing is now, and because of the way, because of the expectations agents have of writers, especially first-time writers or writers who don't have a lot of experience, and because you don't have a lot of time to hook an agent's or a publisher's or an editor's attention, you're usually going to submit, when you're querying agents, when you're trying to get a publisher or an agent, they're usually only going to read the first 5 pages, maybe the first 10 pages, and make a decision of whether they should continue. I would strongly recommend coming up with a prologue that immediately will capture your reader's interest, okay? So what I did, so with my mystery novel that I'm working on right now, I've got my main character, Sam, but I don't start my story with Sam. I actually start my story with the murder that he witnesses on video later on at his job. And so I put the reader right into, I basically throw the reader right into that murder immediately, okay? So think about that as a potential idea. If you can't think of a way to do it with your particular story, that's okay. Let's talk about the easiest way to develop Act 1, okay? So I'm gonna give you 3 prompts, and I want you to try to fill out these prompts for your own story, and I'll show you how I would do it for my story. So here we go. Ready? Prompt number 1. Once upon a time, there was a blank. And at the end of this prompt, fill in the name of your character and who that character is, okay? Think about your protagonist here, all right? The second prompt is an everyday blank. So what is a normal day in the life of your character? What is a normal day that, your character wakes up? What does your character do next? My dog is being really cute right now. She is just being super cute. Do something cute. She doesn't realize it though. Okay, anyway, sorry. What does your character do on a daily basis? Okay, fill that out. And then the third prompt is until one day blank. And what you're going to do at the end of this prompt is you are essentially going to introduce some sort of inciting incident in order to get the story moving, okay? So the moment our main character, the moment our protagonist's life is upended in some way, that's when the story is going to kick in, right? And this can be really helpful for the first 20 to 30 pages. Stephen King is really good at doing this. He has a lot of freedom at this point to, spend the first 100 pages giving us the whole once upon a time there was a blank. Sometimes Stephen King stories feel like a slow burn, which means basically it takes a long time for that inciting incident to happen. If you want a really good example of that, read The Stand, for example, because The Stand, we are introduced to a lot of characters before the virus even escapes and before the virus actually spreads, okay? Another one, I'm reading a book right now called The Deluge, and it's a really good book. It's really enjoyable. I'm having a great time reading it. It took, I kid you not, it took about 100 pages before I started to realize where it was going, because I was getting chapters of so many individual characters who ultimately keep popping up for the rest of the story. But early on, it was hard to sort of see that connection. And my advice to you is don't do this. Don't create a slow burn story, because the authors who do it have earned that street cred with their publishers. Like, they get a long leash. Stephen King gets a long leash when he's writing a story, okay? We as beginning writers or writers who don't have a lot of street cred, who don't have a book that's sold, 100,000 copies, we're not going to have that kind of trust with a publisher or agent. You're going to have to get into the action pretty quickly, okay? Because you need to hook their interest, all right? Unless your writing is so prolific, unless the stuff you're creating is so beautiful that the reader is just going to keep on reading, even if they have a busy schedule, even if they're, in the middle of 7 other books that they're working on professionally. I mean, it's very unlikely. Okay. So what we're thinking about here is we're thinking about brevity. We're thinking about getting to Act 2 where the challenges start to pile up. And in order to get to Act 2, something has to happen in the first 20 to 30 pages that upends your protagonist's life in some way. Essentially takes your protagonist out of their comfort zone and throws them into a new situation. And then, they'll develop a want, they'll develop a need later on, or, around this time. And they'll be faced with challenges in Act 2, right? And then eventually we'll get to Act 3 where the climax happens and they, overcome their challenges or fail or whatever you decide, right? So when I wrote my first horror novel, The Beyond, I had this character who was a private investigator, and his normal job was, his normal life was basically he takes a job with someone who thinks their wife is cheating on them. He follows around the wife, he takes photos, he collects evidence, and then, at the end of the job when he's paid, he gives all the evidence to the suspicious spouse, right? That's like his normal job. That's a normal day in the life of this guy whose name was Ben. And one day, a young woman visits his agency, visits his office, and tells him that her brother has gone missing. And she offers to pay him to go to the town where her brother was living. Her brother was living in this coal mining town. And basically, she pays him to go and investigate. And the caveat is that she wants to go with him. And so Ben and this other person go to this coal mining town. And now Ben is out of his comfort zone because this is a really weird town. Some weird things are happening, and this young lady's brother is nowhere to be seen, and everybody's acting kind of strange. And that gets me into Act 2, where they start to face some significant challenges in their investigation, okay? So that's what we're going for with Act 1. We're trying to get to this moment where your protagonist is uncomfortable, is thrown out of their comfort zone. And a word of caution here, and I'm going to throw in these little tidbits as we go. A word of caution, I don't think you should go more than 10 pages per chapter. I think you should aim for 10, maximum 12 pages per chapter. And the reason is because this is kind of like the standard now, 10 to 12 pages. It's what readers expect, and more importantly, it's what agents and editors tend to expect too. It's not so much a matter of readers' shorter attention spans, it's more of a trend, okay? And I think you should try to follow that. So when we're talking about Act 1, we're talking about maybe 2 to 3 chapters, and that's it, okay? By the time you get to the end of Chapter 3 in your book your novel in progress, we should be ready to move into Act 2. Your character, your protagonist, should be outside of their comfort zone. The inciting incident should have happened, and they should be ready to take on some new challenges. Now let's talk about the inciting incident. When I say the inciting incident, what I mean is literally the incident or the event that takes place that causes our protagonist to either lose something or to develop a specific want that they will pursue for the remainder of the story, okay? So with some of the stories that I've talked about, in Neil Gaiman's American Gods, for example, Shadow, the main character, the inciting incident, I think you could argue that it's him getting out of prison, but I think a more clear inciting incident is probably him meeting his first god, That seems like the inciting incident to me. With The Stand by Stephen King, obviously the inciting incident is when the virus escapes the facility because a guard tries to flee after an outbreak. With a movie, if you want to visualize a movie in terms of an inciting incident, you could look at Jurassic Park as having a pretty significant inciting incident, which is that essentially the electricity goes out on the fences and the T-Rex escapes. That's probably the most clear inciting incident. So if you think about Jurassic Park from this perspective of once upon a time and every day until one day prompts, you could imagine once upon a time there was a duo of scientists, Dr. Ellie Sattler and Dr. Alan Grant, right? And every day they dug up fossils until one day their financier, John Hammond, showed up with an invitation to visit his park. And then they end up at the park and they realize that it's a park full of dinosaurs, right? So you kind of get to that point and you can imagine that there's multiple inciting incidences, but I think the one that drastically changes the main characters is when the T-Rex escapes, okay? And again, like that kind of complication you don't necessarily need in your story. What you really want to focus on is just making sure that you have an incident or an event that is going to basically thrust your character into this new unknown world. Kind of like the way the hero's journey takes the hero away from their homeland and forces them to go on a quest, in other words. I hate to say this, but almost every story really is a hero's journey story. Even the most common, books and movies and TV shows you've read, even something like Buffy the Vampire Slayer is technically the hero's journey to some degree. So if that helps you, if thinking about it from the perspective of the hero's journey helps you, then by all means think about it like that. A couple of other things that I want you to think about as you're developing Act 1 and actually writing it. You could conceivably have a prologue that sets up or teases what's going to happen. You could conceivably have a chapter 1 that introduces the reader to your protagonist and walks your reader through their daily life. You could end chapter 1 with the inciting incident. You could move into chapter 2 where your character has to immediately deal with the inciting incident. And then chapter 3 could potentially be Act 2. It could be the start of Act 2. Another way you could do it is you could have chapter 1 be about your protagonist and their daily life, their normal life, what a normal life looks like. Chapter 2 could be the inciting incident as an event that takes an entire chapter for you to explain or detail. And then chapter 3 could be this sort of transition chapter where your protagonist or your main character is trying to deal with the aftermath of the inciting incident, but can't fully contain it, right? So it'd be easy to imagine this in a sci-fi perspective, where I'm reading a story right now, a really great story, where one of the main characters is coming out of cryosleep, and the first chapter is sort of they're trying to figure out where they are in the star system. And chapter 1, one of the chapters ends with them realizing that there is a distress beacon that they don't recognize. And then in chapter 2, they're arguing about the characters that have come out of hypersleep are arguing about what to do about this beacon. They're sort of building a conflict early on. And then in the next chapter is when they actually decide how to make contact with this beacon. And that's where the inciting incident really starts to kick in, okay? One of the things I want to caution you against, especially if you're writing science fiction, is don't get bogged down in the minutiae of the science A lot of science fiction authors and a lot of fantasy writers too spend a ton of time world building, and then they try to put as much of that as they can into the first, 5 or 6 chapters of their book. And it becomes an absolute mess because you lose sight of the story. So as you're writing your first draft of these first 3 chapters, focus on this idea that you need to introduce your protagonist, show the readers what a normal day in the life of looks like, or what their normal life looks like, okay? And then introduce the inciting incident and have your protagonist react to it. And then we will jump into Act 2 once we have that particular set accomplished, okay? When we go into Act 2, when we talk about Act 2, we're going to spend a ton of time building challenges, additional challenges for our main character, discarding some, adding some that we've come up with, thinking about this from the perspective of someone who really doesn't want their protagonist to succeed, so that we can really punish them, which is one of the things that we're going to like readers love to see happen. For me personally, as I'm writing my mystery novel, I'm thinking about this from the perspective of, once upon a time, there was a young man named Sam. He's 25 years old. He's a dropout from technical college. He's got a job working for one of the biggest social networks on the planet. And every day he goes into work. His job is to literally flag videos that are inappropriate. His job is literally to delete videos and posts that violate the community guidelines. Until one day he sees a video of a murder, and he recognizes where the murder takes place. So those are my initial steps to creating Act 1 for my book. So that's what we got so far. We're rolling, we're cruising along now. We're going to jump into Act 2 very soon. I've got one more video just to get you thinking about what you can do in Act 2 to make it super interesting. For now, focus on getting to the inciting incident in your book. Keep writing. Remember, don't set goals for yourself. Just write when you can, when the ideas come to you, and take your time. You're doing great.